The heat in Mesquite Crossing did not just press down from the sun. It rose from the earth itself. A shimmering wave of baked dust and forgotten promises. It seeped through the soles of worn boots and clung to the back of a man's throat. Sheriff Jonah Pike felt it in his bones, a dry ache that mirrored the thirst of the land. He stood on the raised boardwalk outside his office, watching the slow, tired dance of the town. A wagon creaked. A hammer rang from the blacksmith's shop, but the loudest sound was the rhythmic, desperate squeal of the pump handle at the communal well. Each rise and fall of the handle seemed to take more effort than the last, and the water that trickled into the waiting buckets was a murky brown, carrying the taste of the dregs. The line was short today, not because people were not thirsty, but because they knew the effort was nearly fruitless. An old mesquite tree stood near the well, its leaves sparse and brittle. Yet it clung to life, its roots driven deep into the cracked soil, a stubborn testament to survival. Jonah often found himself looking at that tree, finding a strange kinship with its refusal to surrender. Beside the pump, a single tin dipper hung from a hook, scoured and dented from years of use. It was a small thing, but it was the heart of the town, a symbol that what little they had, they shared. He turned his gaze down the dusty main street. Mesquite Crossing was a town held together by habit and the far-off hope of rain. Its lifeblood was cattle, but the herds were thin this season. The grazing land scorched to a pale tan, the promise of the railroad. Once a beacon of prosperity, now felt like a threat, its iron tracks consuming the very grasslands the cattle needed. A small hand tugged at his trousers. He looked down into the bright, curious eyes of his nephew, Tommy, at 8 years old. Tommy had a reservoir of energy that seemed to defy the oppressive heat. His face was smudged with dirt, and a slingshot peeked from his back pocket. "What is it, Sprout?" Jonah asked, his voice a low rumble. "Are we going to run out of water? Uncle Jonah!" Jonah rested a hand on the boy's unruly hair. "We will make do," he said. "We always do." His words felt hollow even to himself. He had learned in the cavalry that you did not speak of the fear. You simply faced what was in front of you. But this was a different kind of enemy. You could not shoot a drought. He had been raising Tommy for 2 years, ever since the fever took his sister, leaving the boy an orphan and Jonah with a responsibility he had never expected. His own wife, Mary, had been taken by a winter cough 4 years prior, and the quiet grief of it still settled in his chest on long nights. He lived a frugal life, his sheriff's pay barely enough to keep them fed and clothed. The small house behind the jail was tidy but spare, his days measured by patrols, paperwork, and Tommy's endless questions. He often used a light, sardonic humor to deflect the tension that hung over the town like a shroud, a habit that some mistook for indifference. They did not see the worry etched around his eyes. His gaze drifted to the wide glass window of the general store. In the loft above the barrels of flour and bolts of calico, a woman sat bent over her work. Eliza Hart, though most folks called her Lila. She had arrived a few months back, a quiet seamstress taking up residence in the small room at the back of the store. She kept to herself, her needle moving with a swift, certain grace. She was a woman of few words and efficient action, her presence a calm island in the town's anxious sea, in a place where everyone's business was common knowledge. She was a closed book. People saw a respectable, solitary woman making a living. They did not see the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes as she watched the comings and goings of the town, the way she listened more than she spoke, filing away every overheard conversation, every whispered rumor. Jonah saw it, though he was a man trained to observe, and he saw the watchfulness in her stillness. She was not just sewing shirts, she was stitching together the story of Mesquite Crossing. He did not know that her quiet life was a carefully constructed facade, that the name Hart connected her not to some distant, unknown family, but to the Hart Cattle and Land Trust, an immense network of deeds and water rights that encompassed nearly half the county. She was its sole, legal heir, hiding in plain sight, investigating the slow bleed of her family's legacy. Across the street, 3 men emerged from the saloon, their laughter loud and abrasive against the town's weary quiet. The first was Luke Madigan, a man whose wealth had grown as the grasslands had shrunk. He was a cattle baron who had expanded into freight, his wagons charging exorbitant prices to haul supplies. He walked with the heavy confidence of a man who owned the ground he stood on. Beside him was Judge Groves, a man whose robes seemed to hide a spine made of jelly and a palm perpetually open for a bribe. His face was flushed with whiskey, his eyes small and shrewd. Trailing them, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt, was Deputy Hale, Jonah's own second in command. Hale was a mean-spirited man with a swagger that far outstripped his courage, loyal only to the highest bidder, which was invariably Madigan. They paused, and Madigan gestured expansively with his cigar. "The railroad needs land," he boomed, his voice carrying in the still air. "And the Hart Trust is sitting on the best of it. Word is, they are ready to sell the whole lot. A smart man would get ahead of it." Jonah's jaw tightened. That rumor had been circulating for weeks, a poison seeping into the town's already fractured morale. If the Heartlands, which held the rights to the deepest aquifers in the region, were sold to the railroad, the ranchers and smallholders would be choked out completely. Madigan and Groves would undoubtedly be there to buy up the scraps for pennies on the dollar. Hale chuckled, a greasy sound. "Let them worry. More for us when they pack up and leave." He glanced toward the general store, his eyes lingering on the loft window where Lila sat. A shame about that one. Too quiet. A woman like that needs a man to give her something to talk about. Jonah felt a muscle jump in his cheek. He despised Hale's crude nature. But the man was the judge's cousin, a political necessity he was forced to endure. He stepped off the boardwalk, his boots sinking into the thick dust. "That is enough, Hale," he said, his voice even but cold as well water. "Get back to your rounds." Hale's smirk faltered slightly at his tone. Madigan simply gave Jonah a dismissive look, as if swatting away a fly, and led his companions back toward the judge's office. Power did not need to shout. It simply was. Later that evening, the heat finally relented, leaving a bruised purple sky in its wake. Jonah sat at his desk, the day's report spread before him. Tommy was asleep in the back room, his soft breathing a comforting rhythm. The town was quiet, but it was a restless quiet. Jonah could feel the fear coiling in the shadows. The water, the land, the railroad. It was a 3-headed serpent, and Madigan held the leash. He thought of the quiet seamstress. A woman alone in a town like this faced a hard road. The unspoken rules were rigid. She was an object of pity for some, suspicion for others, and crude speculation for men like Hale. Yet she seemed untouched by it, her composure a shield he could not quite understand. In her small room above the darkened general store, Eliza Hart was not sleeping. The lamp was turned low, casting long shadows on the walls. Her sewing basket was set aside. Spread across her small table were not patterns and thread, but county maps and copies of land deeds retrieved from the Territorial Records Office under a different name. Her finger traced the lines of the Hart property, a vast, sprawling territory. She cross-referenced them with a ledger, her pen making small, neat notations. For months, she had been tracking the discrepancies. Water rights deeded away for a fraction of their worth. Grazing leases transferred under questionable circumstances. Signatures that looked authentic at first glance but revealed subtle forgeries under a magnifying glass. Every trail, no matter how convoluted, eventually led back to 2 names, Luke Madigan and Judge Groves. The rumor of the railroad sale was their creation, a smokescreen to panic the locals while they carved up the land from the inside. She paused, looking at a particular deed for a deep well on the eastern pasture. It had been transferred to Madigan's name 3 months ago, the paperwork authorized by Judge Groves, citing unpaid taxes, but the Hart Trust's taxes were paid years in advance. It was theft, plain and simple, dressed up in legal language. She felt a cold, steady anger settle within her. This was not just about land or money. It was her father's legacy, built on handshakes and hard work, and they were dismantling it with lies and greed. She was here not just to reclaim her property, but to restore its purpose. The land was meant to support the community, not to be a weapon used to strangle it. A floorboard creaked below. She froze, blowing out the lamp and moving silently to the window. In the moonlight, she saw Sheriff Pike on his final patrol. He stopped near the old mesquite tree. His shoulders slumped for just a moment, the weight of his office and the town's troubles visible even in the dim light. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the storefronts, and for a second, it felt as though he was looking right at her. Through the darkness and the glass, he could not see her, of course. She was just a shadow in a dark room. For now, that was exactly what she needed to be. Jonah finished his rounds, the silence of the night offering no comfort. He stopped at the town well, placing his hand on the cold iron of the pump. He thought of Tommy's question, "Are we going to run out of water?" He did not have an answer. All he had was a tin star, a worn-out gun, and a deep-seated conviction that justice was more than just words in a law book. It was about protecting the decent, hard-working people of this town from the vultures circling overhead. As he turned for home, he glanced once more at the dark loft window of the general store, a closed door in a town full of them. He had a feeling that whatever future Mesquite Crossing had, it was hidden behind one of them, waiting for the right moment to open. The weekly market was breathing its last for the day. The frenzy of trade had softened into the weary packing of wares, and the low, golden light of twilight filtered through the dust kicked up by departing wagons. It was a time of day Jonah Pike usually found peaceful, a brief pause between the heat of the afternoon and the deep quiet of the night. He was walking his patrol, Tommy skipping ahead and then circling back like a tireless sheepdog. He saw her then, wrestling with a heavy bolt of dark wool. Eliza Hart was trying to load her remaining goods onto a small handcart, but a sudden gust of wind, a mischievous desert ghost, caught the fabric and threatened to unspool it across the dusty street. Other vendors were too consumed with their own packing to notice. Jonah quickened his pace. "Here, let me help you with that. Miss Hart." She looked up, a flicker of surprise in her calm eyes before she nodded her thanks. Her hands were strong and capable, but the bolt was awkward. Together. They wrestled it onto the cart, the wind tugging at it like a petulant child. When it was finally secure, Jonah found himself lingering. A strand of her dark hair had come loose, and the setting sun caught the warm tones in it. He felt an unaccustomed awkwardness, a feeling he had not had in years. "Can I walk you home?" The question came out before he had fully formed it in his mind, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Tommy, who had been busy examining a discarded horseshoe, piped up immediately. "But Uncle Jonah, you do not even know the way to her home." A faint smile touched Lila's lips, a rare and fleeting thing that softened the serious set of her mouth. She looked from the boy to the sheriff, her gaze direct and unwavering. "The path is mine to choose," she said, her voice low and clear. "I only need someone to walk beside me." The words hung in the air between them, imbued with a meaning that went far beyond the simple walk to the general store. Jonah felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling as welcome and unfamiliar as a summer rain. He was about to reply when two figures strode into the market square, their shadows long and sharp in the fading light. Luke Madigan and Deputy Hale. They walked with a purpose that immediately silenced the remaining chatter. A cold knot formed in Jonah's stomach. Hale carried a hammer and a rolled document. Madigan stood a pace behind, arms crossed over his chest, a smug look of ownership on his face. Hale marched directly to the communal well, the town's tired, faltering heart. He unrolled the document and, with a loud rap of his hammer, nailed it to the wooden frame of the pump. "By order of the Territorial Court," Hale announced, his voice carrying an unpleasant note of triumph, "this well is hereby sealed." A wave of disbelief and fear rippled through the small crowd. "What are you talking about?" Hale the blacksmith called out, his face incredulous. Hale pointed a thick finger at the notice. Due to delinquent land and water access taxes owed by the township of Mesquite Crossing, all public water sources are placed under administrative control. He paused for effect. Which is to say, they are closed. Panic began to set in. "But our taxes are paid," a woman cried out, her voice trembling. "Judge Groves has reviewed the ledgers," Madigan said smoothly. Stepping forward, "There are significant arrears, but do not worry. Being a civic-minded man, I have arranged for water to be made available. My freight wagons will begin selling barrels tomorrow morning. For a reasonable price. Of course." Jonah pushed through the stunned townspeople, his eyes hard. "Let me see that order." Hale smirked and gestured to the notice. "It is official. Sheriff." Jonah ripped the paper from the post. The ink was slightly smeared, the language deliberately vague, citing statutes and codes no one present would know. But it was the seal at the bottom that caught his eye. It was the official court seal, but it was pressed unevenly, the wax thicker on one side than the other, as if applied in haste or by an unfamiliar hand. "This is not right," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is a sham." Madigan's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning an order of the court?" "Pike." "That is a serious accusation. Judge Groves would be very interested to hear it. Perhaps he might conclude that Mesquite Crossing needs a sheriff who understands how to cooperate with the law, not obstruct it." The threat was clear, wrapped in the thin veneer of legal process. Get out of the way. Jonah stood his ground, the useless paper crushed in his fist. "I will not." Hale, on Madigan's signal, produced a heavy chain and a thick padlock. He began to wrap the chain around the pump handle, securing it to the wooden frame. The clanking of the metal was a death knell. Each link that fell into place was another nail in the town's coffin. The people watched in horrified silence, their faces a mixture of fear and impotent rage. Madigan's men would not be selling water. They would be selling survival. And they could name any price they wished. While Hale finished his work, Jonah's eyes scanned the crowd. He saw the Miller family huddled together, their faces pale with despair. Samuel Miller was a small rancher whose property bordered the heartlands, and the drought had hit him harder than most. He was already behind on his mortgage payments at the bank. Without free water for his family and his few remaining cattle, he would be ruined within a week. The bank's agent, a weaselly man named Peterson, was already there, hovering near the Millers like a vulture. Suddenly, Jonah saw a quiet movement on the edge of the crowd. It was Lila Hart. She had not left. She was watching the scene with an intensity that seemed at odds with her usual placid demeanor. Her eyes were fixed on the Miller family, her expression unreadable. Then, with a subtle, decisive movement, she pushed her handcart to the side and walked not towards her home, but towards Peterson. Jonah watched, intrigued. She spoke to the agent in a low voice, her back to the crowd. He saw Peterson's eyebrows shoot up in surprise. There was a brief, hushed negotiation. Lila opened her reticule and took out a small, leather-bound purse. Jonah saw the glint of gold coins, a sum that seemed far beyond the means of a simple seamstress. She counted out several coins into Peterson's eager hand. He quickly produced a document from his satchel Miller's mortgage note. Lila took it, glanced over it, and then, using Peterson's back as a desk, she signed a transfer of ownership at the bottom. The entire transaction took less than a minute. She folded the document, placed it in her reticule, gave Peterson a curt nod, and walked away as quietly as she had appeared. The agent, looking dazed and richer, scurried away. The Miller family, unaware of the miracle that had just occurred, remained locked in their despair. No one had noticed except Jonah. He was stunned. A seamstress did not carry that kind of money. A seamstress did not buy up mortgages in the middle of a town crisis. He approached her as she retrieved her cart. The chaos was starting to subside into a low murmur of frightened conversations. "What was that about?" "Miss Hart," he asked, keeping his voice low. She met his gaze without flinching. Just settling a small account. That was no small account, he countered. He had seen the look on Peterson's face. I must say, you calculate sums faster than our town banker. A wry, almost bitter, smile touched her lips. In my line of work, Sheriff, you learn that stitching a fine seam and stitching up a deal both require a steady hand, and you must always know the quality of the material you are working with. Her words were a riddle, another layer to the mystery she presented. Before he could press her further, she turned to leave. She paused and looked back at him, her expression serious. Be careful, Sheriff Pike. The ink on that notice is not the only thing that is crooked in this town. She then pushed her cart toward the general store, leaving him standing there with the crumpled court order in his hand and 1,000 new questions in his mind. Later, in the privacy of her room, Lila lit her lamp. She did not look at the mortgage note first. Instead, she took out a small, folded receipt that Peterson had given her, an itemized bill for the filing fees associated with the mortgage transfer. It was standard procedure, but at the bottom of the list of official charges, there was an unusual entry, a judicial processing levy. It was a small amount, easily overlooked, but it was not a tax she had ever encountered in her study of the territorial laws. And next to it, scrawled in a familiar, elegant script, were the initials J.G., Judge Groves. He was not just turning a blind eye to Madigan's schemes, he was getting a cut directly, skimming off the top of every transaction, every misfortune that passed through his court and the bank. It was a small piece of evidence, but it was a start. It was a thread, and she knew better than anyone how to follow a thread to see what it would unravel. Her decision was made. Revealing her identity now would be a mistake. They would tie her up in legal challenges, using the very court system they controlled. She had to gather more proof, find the rot at the core of their operation. She looked at the mortgage note for the Miller property. She had saved one family tonight, but to save the town, she would have to remain Eliza Hart, the quiet seamstress. She would have to keep fighting from the shadows, with the only weapon she had, her needle, her wits, and the vast, hidden power of the Hart name. The conflict was no longer just about land, it was about the soul of a town, and it had been declared tonight with the clang of a chain at the public well. The days that followed the sealing of the well were thick with a silent, simmering desperation. Luke Madigan's water wagon became the town's new center, a symbol of its subjugation. The price of a barrel was triple the usual rate, a ransom paid in sweat and dignity. Jonah Pike's office was a revolving door of complaints he was powerless to address. His authority felt like a hollow shell. Madigan's threat to have him replaced hung in the air, a constant reminder of the compromised system he served. Frustrated, Jonah sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office requesting copies of all recent land and water right transfers within the county. He paid for it out of his own pocket. When the thick manila envelope arrived a week later, he spread the documents across his desk under the lamplight, the official papers feeling alien in his rough hands. He spent hours tracing the legal jargon, his finger following the lines of ownership. A pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. Over the past 6 months, a dozen small wells and springs, all on the periphery of the vast Hart Cattle and Land Trust holdings, had been signed over. The buyers were different each time, names he did not recognize, but the authorizing agent was always the same Judge Alistair Groves. The paperwork was meticulous, the reasoning for each transfer, airtight unpaid fees, lapsed claims, surveying disputes. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, but the final page of one file made him sit up straight. It was a deed transfer for a spring south of the Miller place. At the bottom, next to the official court seal, was a second, smaller embossed mark in the wax. It was a fancy, looping monogram, Eiki. It was not the court's property. It was the judge's personal mark, the kind a man might use on his private stationery, an act of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He had signed his crime. Jonah stared at the mark, the final piece of a puzzle he was only just beginning to understand. The map of the land was being redrawn in secret, its very pulse, its underground water, being diverted into Madigan's control. The next morning, a rancher named Henry Cole stormed into his office, his face ashen. "They are gone. Sheriff, my whole herd, 20 head, just vanished in the night." Jonah saddled his horse and rode out with Cole. The tracks were clear for a time, then deliberately scattered near a rocky outcrop that bordered Madigan's sprawling ranch. Deputy Hale met them at the property line, his expression a mixture of boredom and contempt. "Just strayed. Pike," Hale said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Jonah's boot. "Madigan's boys found them this morning mixed in with his own stock. Lucky for Cole here." "We both know they did not just stray," Jonah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Prove it," Hale sneered, and turned his back. There was nothing Jonah could do. Without a witness, it was Cole's word against Madigan's. Cole got his cattle back, but a finder's fee was deducted, leaving him deeper in debt. It was another turn of the screw. A message to everyone in Mesquite Crossing: we can take whatever we want. That afternoon, seeking a moment of peace, Jonah walked toward the general store. He found Tommy sitting on the steps, his chin in his hands, looking miserable. A long tear ran down the sleeve of his best shirt. "What is all this?" Sprout Jonah asked. Sitting beside him, "Looks like you fought a bobcat." "Worse," Tommy mumbled. "That old mesquite tree." Jonah was about to suggest they go home so he could attempt a clumsy repair when the door to the store opened. Eliza Hart stepped out, a small sewing basket in her hand. "A disagreement with a branch. I see," she said, her eyes kind as she looked at Tommy's torn sleeve. "Come inside, young man. I can fix that in a moment." Before Tommy could protest, she had ushered him into the cool, dim interior of the store. Jonah followed, feeling large and out of place among the barrels and bolts of cloth. Lila sat Tommy on a stool, her needle flashing in the light from the window. She worked with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. "You like baked beans more than you like spelling, do you not?" she asked Tommy, her voice gentle. Tommy's eyes went wide. "How did you know?" "Your uncle talks about it," she said, not looking up from her work. "He says beans do not need to be spelled. They just need to be eaten." A small grin broke through Tommy's gloom. Jonah felt a flush of surprise. He did not remember ever saying that to her. She must have overheard him talking to the boy one day in the street. The thought that she listened, that she remembered such a small, silly detail about them, stirred something in his chest. She finished the seam, the stitches so neat they were nearly invisible. "There," she said, "good as new." She then picked up a short length of leather cord from her basket. "Let me show you something my father taught me. It is a knot for tying a saddle cinch, but it is useful for all sorts of things. It is called a bowline. It never slips, and it never jams." She guided Tommy's small hands, showing him how to loop the cord, her touch patient and sure. Jonah watched them, his throat suddenly tight, the simple domesticity of the scene, the woman's gentle care for his boy, felt like a window into a life he had thought was lost to him forever. Mary had been like that, her hands always busy, always creating or mending. The memory was a sharp, unexpected pain. He felt the old fear rise up, the fear of attachment, of building something only to have it ripped away. He took a half step back, creating a distance that was more emotional than physical. "Thank you, Miss Hart," he said, his voice more formal than he intended. "We have taken enough of your time." Lila looked up, her gaze meeting his. He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, as if she could see the wall he had just thrown up between them. She simply nodded. It was no trouble at all. "Sheriff?" The sky began to change 2 days later. The brilliant, merciless blue faded to a sickly yellow gray. The wind, usually a hot breath, began to blow in sharp, violent gusts, picking up the topsoil and hurling it into the air. A dust storm was coming. People scurried to shutter their windows and secure their livestock. The world shrank to the narrow confines of four walls as the air grew thick and choking. The storm raged for a full day, a relentless assault of wind and grit. By the second morning, when the wind finally began to subside, a thick brown haze hung over everything, and a fine layer of dust coated every surface, inside and out. Then the news came, spreading from house to house like a fever. Madigan's water wagon, the town's sole source of replenishment, had been caught in the storm on its way from the river. It had overturned. Its entire precious cargo spilled into the thirsty dust. Real panic, cold and sharp, set in. The town's reserves were gone. The well was chained. The sky was clear but offered no hope. Madigan expressed his profound regrets. Of course, promising another wagon in 3 days, maybe 4. As the townspeople gathered in the street, their faces etched with fear, Lila Hart walked calmly out of the general store. She went directly to the blacksmith and 2 other sturdy men Jonah knew to be reliable. "Follow me," she said, her voice cutting through the anxious murmurs, "and bring crowbars." Jonah moved to intercept her. "Miss Hart, what are you doing?" "There is no time." "Sheriff," she replied, not breaking her stride, "just trust me." He did not know why, but he did. He followed her and the small group of men as she led them away from the main street, toward a derelict stone building on the edge of town. It had been an old pumping station and warehouse for the Hart Trust, abandoned for years. The doors were boarded shut. "Pry them open," she ordered the men. With a groan of protesting wood, the doors gave way, revealing a vast, dark space, thick with the smell of dust and disuse. Lila walked inside as if she owned the place, navigating the debris-strewn floor with an unerring sense of direction. She led them to the far back corner. There, set into the stone floor, was a series of heavy iron lids. "Help me with these," she said. The men strained, and with a screech of rusted metal, they lifted the heavy covers. Below was a massive cistern, lined with cut stone and filled nearly to the top with clean, clear water. A collective gasp went through the small group. "My father built this as a reserve for drought years," Lila explained, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "It is fed by a deep aquifer. It has not been used in a decade, but the water is still good." The men stared at her, dumbfounded. "How did you know this was here?" the blacksmith asked. "I heard stories," she said evasively. "Now, we need to get this pump working." She pointed to a large, rust-covered manual pump connected to a series of pipes and valves. While the men stared at the complex machinery, Lila moved with confident purpose. She grabbed a wrench from a dusty tool bench, her hands finding the right size without hesitation. She tightened a leaking joint here, turned a valve there, her movements economical and precise. She knew this system. She knew it like the back of her own hand. "Prime it with this," she said, handing the blacksmith a small bucket of water she had drawn from the cistern. After a few minutes of groaning and clanking, the pump sputtered to life. A steady stream of fresh water gushed from the outflow pipe. The men let out a cheer. Jonah just stared at Lila. He saw not just a seamstress, but a woman of deep and hidden knowledge. The map of the underground water was not just on paper for her, it was in her head, a living part of her. She was the one holding the reins, and he had never even known it. He felt a profound sense of guilt for his earlier withdrawal, his fear. While he had been protecting himself, she had been planning how to protect everyone. In that dusty warehouse, surrounded by the machinery of survival, Jonah Pike realized that Eliza Hart was not just a resident of Mesquite Crossing. She was its lifeline. The discovery of the hidden cistern transformed Mesquite Crossing, hope, a commodity scarcer than water, returned in a steady stream. An organized system of rationing was established. With Lila Hart at its unspoken center, she directed the work with a quiet authority that no one questioned, her knowledge of the old pump station's mechanics proving indispensable. For a few days, a fragile peace settled over the town. Madigan's power had been checked, and the people felt a renewed sense of community, a shared ownership of their survival. But it was the kind of peace that comes in the eye of a storm, a deceptive calm before the wind howls again. The fire started long after midnight, a flicker of orange against the black velvet of the desert sky. Jonah was asleep in his chair, the stack of land deeds still on his desk, when the frantic banging on his office door jolted him awake. It was the blacksmith, his face wild with alarm. "Fire! Sheriff! At the old warehouse." Jonah was on his feet in an instant, his heart seizing with cold dread. The warehouse, the water! He buckled on his gun belt and ran out into the street. The glow in the sky had grown into a monstrous, pulsing heart, casting dancing, demonic shadows across the buildings. People were spilling from their homes, their voices a rising chorus of panic. As he neared the blaze, the heat was a physical blow, a wall of scorching air that drove him back. The stone building had become a furnace, flames licking from every window and devouring the dry timber of the roof. Their lifeline was being incinerated before their eyes. Then a woman's shriek cut through the roar of the fire, a sound of pure terror. "My boy, has anyone seen my son?" It was Martha, who lived in the small house nearest the warehouse. "He is not in his bed. He said he wanted to see the big pump." Jonah's blood ran cold. He turned and saw Tommy's bed through the window of his own small house. It was empty. The neatly folded blanket, the small toy soldier on the pillow, empty. A primal fear, sharper and more terrible than any he had ever known, clawed at his throat. He had checked on the boy an hour ago. He must have slipped out. "Tommy!" he bellowed, his voice cracking against the roar of the flames. "Tommy!" He saw a small shape move near a side entrance, where a section of the wall had already collapsed. It was not his nephew. It was Lila Hart. She was dragging a heavy wool blanket from a nearby wagon and plunging it into a horse trough, her movements frantic but purposeful. "What are you doing?" he shouted, grabbing her arm. "You cannot go in there." "His boy, Jonah. Tommy is in there," she cried, her face streaked with soot and lit by the hellish orange light. "He followed me there yesterday. He was fascinated by the gears. He must have gone back." Before Jonah could react, she had wrapped the soaking wet blanket around herself and plunged into the inferno through the broken doorway. For a second, Jonah was paralyzed, torn between his duty to stop her and the blinding terror for his boy. Then his training, his instinct, took over. He grabbed another half-empty bucket of water, doused his own jacket and head, and followed her in. The heat was unimaginable, a living thing that stole the air from his lungs. Smoke billowed in thick, choking clouds, reducing visibility to near zero. He could hear the great roof beams groaning overhead, ready to surrender to the fire. "Lila," he coughed, his voice a raw rasp. "Over here." Her voice was faint, but it was enough. He stumbled towards the sound, shielding his eyes from the searing embers. He found her near the great pump, a section of the roof having collapsed and pinned her leg. Beside her, huddled beneath her soaked coat, was Tommy, crying and terrified, but unharmed. Lila had taken the brunt of the falling debris. "Get the boy," she gasped, her face pale with pain. Jonah scooped Tommy into his arms, the boy clinging to him with desperate strength. "I will be right back for you," he promised, his eyes locking with hers for a brief, intense moment. He turned and ran, navigating the treacherous, burning landscape, his lungs screaming for air. He burst out into the night and thrust Tommy into the arms of the nearest person. Without a second's hesitation, he turned to go back in. "No, Sheriff, you will not make it," the blacksmith yelled, trying to hold him back. "The whole thing is coming down." Jonah shook him off and charged back into the collapsing structure. He found Lila where he had left her, trying to free her leg from under the heavy, smoldering beam. The main roof truss above them was cracking, spitting fire. He put his shoulder under the beam, his muscles screaming in protest, and lifted with everything he had. The beam shifted just enough for her to pull her leg free. He grabbed her, half dragging, half carrying her towards the doorway. They were feet from the exit when the roof finally gave way in a deafening roar. A shower of fire and timber crashing down where they had been only seconds before. They tumbled out into the street, collapsing onto the dusty ground, gasping for the cool night air as the warehouse imploded behind them. The town doctor was overwhelmed, so Jonah carried Lila to his own small house. He laid her gently on the narrow cot in the main room while Tommy, now calm but refusing to leave her side, watched with wide, worried eyes. Her sleeve was burned away, and an angry red burn stretched from her wrist to her elbow. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair singed, but in the lamplight, Jonah had never seen anyone more beautiful or more brave. He sent Tommy to fetch the pot of medicinal salve his sister had always kept. His hands, which had faced down armed men without a tremor, were shaking as he gently cleansed the wound with a cool, damp cloth. The touch of her skin was like a jolt of lightning. He could feel the warmth, the life in her, and it terrified and exhilarated him. He worked in silence, his focus absolute, the chaos of the fire and the town fading away until there was only this small, quiet room. Lila watched him, her eyes dark and searching. When he finished applying the salve and began to wrap her arm in clean linen, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Why do you avoid touching me, Jonah?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, it stopped him cold. He kept his eyes on his work, but he could feel her gaze on him, demanding an honesty he had been hiding from himself. He finished tying the bandage, his fingers brushing against her skin. He let his hand linger for a fraction of a second, a touch that was both a comfort and a confession. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes. His own voice was thick with an emotion he could no longer suppress. "If I touch you once, Lila," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of him, "I am afraid I will not stop." The next morning, Mesquite Crossing awoke to the smoldering ruin of its hope. Luke Madigan was there to fan the embers of their despair. He stood on a wagon in the center of town, his voice booming over the stunned and frightened crowd. "You see what happens," he roared, pointing a finger not at the warehouse, but at Jonah's office. "You put your trust in one man, and he leads you to ruin. That fire was no accident. That warehouse was old. The sheriff knew it. He probably set it himself, hoping to gain control of the water distribution, to make himself a king in this town." Deputy Hale moved through the crowd, his voice a poisonous whisper. Herd Pike was looking to buy up land himself. A fire creates panic. Panicked people sell cheap. The accusations were absurd. But fear is not rational. The crowd, robbed of its water and its security, began to murmur. Doubt, like a tumbleweed, began to roll through the assembled townspeople, gathering momentum. Jonah stepped out of his office, his face grim, and the crowd fell silent, their eyes a mixture of accusation and uncertainty. "That is a lie." "Madigan?" Jonah said, his voice ringing with cold fury. "Is it Madigan?" shot back. "Where is your proof?" "Right here." The voice was not Jonah's. It was Lila's. She stepped forward from the crowd, her arm in a sling, her face pale but resolute. In her good hand, she held a thick leather-bound ledger. She walked to the base of Madigan's wagon, her eyes never leaving his. "This is the supply ledger from the general store," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "2 days ago, Mr. Madigan's freight company purchased 20 gallons of lamp oil, an unusually large amount. Would you not agree far more than is needed for lamps, but just about the right amount to turn an old, dry warehouse into an inferno?" A gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned to Madigan, whose face had gone a mottled red. "It is a lie, a business transaction. That is all." Before the crowd's doubt could solidify, Judge Groves pushed his way to the front, his face a mask of judicial concern. Now, let us not be hasty. Miss Hart, while your civic spirit is admirable, a private business ledger is hardly legal evidence. It proves nothing. It is inadmissible in any official inquiry. I am afraid this line of questioning is closed." He made a small, dismissive gesture with his hand. The legal system itself slamming a door in the face of the truth. But the damage was done. Lila had not won the legal battle, but she had planted a seed of truth in the minds of the people. They looked at Madigan differently now. They looked at the judge differently. Jonah watched it all, and something inside him shifted. He had spent his life believing in the law, in the paper and the ink and the seals. He saw now how easily those things could be twisted. He looked at Lila, standing alone, her only weapon a simple book of numbers and the courage to speak. He had been trying to fight a war with rule books while the enemy burned down the world around him. He had been so afraid of losing what he had that he had almost failed to see what was worth fighting for. Lila was no longer hiding behind the facade of a simple seamstress, and he could no longer hide behind his badge. He walked over and stood beside her, a silent, unwavering statement to the entire town. The lines had been drawn, not in a courtroom, but right here in the dust, under the smoke-filled sky. The small wooden church was the only building in Mesquite Crossing that seemed to defy the heat. Its thick adobe walls held a cool, perpetual twilight, and the air inside smelled of dry timber, old hymnals, and the faint, lingering scent of beeswax. It was packed. Every bench was filled with the anxious, sun-wearied faces of the townspeople. They had come not for a sermon, but for an answer. The destruction of the warehouse and the public accusations had left them suspended in a state of fearful uncertainty. Judge Groves stood at the pulpit, not as a man of God, but as a man of law, a distinction he seemed to relish. He held a law book in his hand like a shield, his voice a soothing, patronizing balm of legalese. "My friends, my neighbors," he began, "we find ourselves in a trying time. It is in such moments that we must cling to the structure of the law, lest we descend into chaos and baseless accusations." He did not look at Lila, but his meaning was clear. "The unfortunate incident at the warehouse is under official investigation, until such time as facts can be ascertained through proper channels. Any speculation, such as that derived from a shopkeeper's ledger, is not only unhelpful, it is legally meaningless." Luke Madigan stood near the front pew, his arms crossed, a look of vindicated authority on his face. He let the judge's words settle, then added his own. "The judge is right. We need order. And until this town can get its affairs straight, I will continue to provide water. The price is the price. The cost of transport is high. If you want stability, you have to pay for it." A low, defeated murmur went through the congregation. They were trapped. The law, which was meant to be their protection, was being used as their cage. Jonah stood at the back of the church, his hand resting on the worn grip of his pistol, a useless talisman against this kind of fight. He felt a familiar, bitter rage building in his chest. Then the church doors opened, letting in a blinding shaft of afternoon sun. Lila Hart stood silhouetted in the doorway. She walked down the central aisle, her steps measured and deliberate, her injured arm held in its sling. She carried no ledger this time. In her hand was a heavy, oilskin-wrapped parcel. The murmuring stopped. Every eye was on her. She did not address the judge or Madigan. She walked to the front of the church and turned to face the people. "My name is Eliza Hart," she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "My father was Daniel Hart." A shockwave of recognition and disbelief passed through the older members of the community. The Hart name was a local legend, a founding family that had long since moved away, leaving their affairs in the hands of distant lawyers and trustees. "I did not come here to be a seamstress," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I came here to understand what was happening to my father's legacy. I came here because I knew it was being stolen." She placed the parcel on the pulpit and untied the leather thongs. She unrolled a series of thick, vellum documents, their edges yellowed with age, their seals a deep, unbroken red. "This is my father's last will and testament," she said, holding up the first document. "And this," she held up the second, is the legally executed instrument of the Hart Cattle and Land Trust. It names me, Eliza Hart, as the sole trustee and legal administrator of all its holdings. That includes," she paused, letting her eyes sweep over the crowd, "nearly every acre of grazing land, every registered spring, and every primary aquifer in the western half of this county." A collective gasp filled the church. The seamstress, the quiet woman from the loft room. She was the owner of it all. The earth beneath their feet, the water they so desperately needed, belonged to her. Jonah felt the floor shift beneath him. It was not a physical sensation, but an emotional earthquake that shook the foundations of everything he thought he knew. He stared at her, at this woman he had felt drawn to, this woman he had confessed his deepest vulnerability to, and saw a complete stranger, a powerful, wealthy stranger who had been living a lie. A cold, professional pride, sharp and bitter, rose up in him. He was the sheriff. It was his job to know the people in his town, to understand the currents of power, and he had been blind. The last man in Mesquite Crossing to know the truth. He felt a fool. He felt deceived. Without a conscious thought, he took a half-step back, into the shadows near the door, putting a physical space between them that mirrored the new chasm in his heart. Madigan was the first to recover, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage, a trick. Judge, tell them." Judge Groves, his face the color of old parchment, stammered, This is highly irregular. These documents must be verified. The trust has been dormant for years. There are procedural requirements. I declare this meeting adjourned until I can review these claims." But Madigan knew he had already lost the room. He saw the looks on the faces of the ranchers, the hope dawning in their eyes. He had to change the narrative, and fast. "Do not be fools," he roared, his voice shaking with fury. "Can you not see what this is? She is no different from the railroad. Another wealthy landowner from back east, coming here to tell us how to live. She will let you have your water, for now, and then she will raise the prices. Then she will call in your debts. She will foreclose on your land. She owns you. Do you want to trade one master for another?" The seed of fear, so recently uprooted, found fertile ground again. The ranchers exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent their lives fighting against the power of big money, be it cattle barons or railroad tycoons. Madigan's words struck a chord of deep, ingrained suspicion. Groves, seeing his opportunity, seized it. "Mr. Madigan has a point. Given the questionable status of this long-dormant trust, and in the interest of public welfare, I am exercising my judicial authority. The water rights controlled by the Hart Trust are hereby placed in public receivership. A formal auction for the lease of these rights will be held in 2 weeks. That is the only fair and legal way." It was a brilliant, vicious counterattack. They had taken her power and turned it against her, painting her as a threat and using the law to strip her of her primary asset. The auction was a sham. Madigan was the only man in the county with enough cash to bid. They would win after all, and they would do it under the color of law. Later, as the sun set, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the town, Jonah sat in his office, staring at the wall. The feelings of betrayal and anger had cooled into a dull, heavy ache. He had trusted her, had allowed himself to feel something for the first time since Mary's death, and it had all been based on a lie. He did not doubt that her cause was just, but the deception stung him personally. It made him feel naive, a feeling he despised. A small noise from the doorway made him look up. Tommy stood there, looking uncertain. Can I go see Miss Lila?" he asked. "My hair's all messy." Jonah started to say no, to keep the boy away from the source of his own confusion and hurt. But he looked at his nephew's earnest, worried face, and the anger faltered. The boy did not care about land deeds or legal trusts. He cared about the woman who had mended his shirt and saved his life. "Go on," he said, his voice flat. He watched from his office as Tommy crossed the street and was welcomed into the general store. A few minutes later, through the window, He could see them in the warm lamplight of Lila's small apartment. Tommy was sitting on a stool, and Lila stood behind him, her uninjured hand gently, patiently braiding his fine, unruly hair. Jonah stood up and walked to the doorway of his own house, watching them from across the street. The sight was so simple, so profoundly gentle. It had nothing to do with power or property. It was an act of quiet care, a moment of peace in a world of turmoil. He saw not the powerful heiress who had deceived him, but the woman who had charged into a burning building for his son. He saw the easy, trusting way Tommy leaned into her touch, and in that moment, he understood. Home was not the roof over his head. It was this. It was the fragile, unspoken promise of a family, a bond forged not by blood, but by choice and by fire. His own wounded pride seemed a small and selfish thing in the face of it. He had a choice to make, between his pride and his trust. Standing there, watching the woman he was falling for take care of the boy he loved, he knew what his choice had to be. The day of the auction dawned suffocatingly bright, the sun a white-hot coin in a bleached blue sky. A makeshift auction block, nothing more than 2 barrels and a plank of wood, had been set up on the steps of the courthouse. The entire town of Mesquite Crossing seemed to be there, their faces grim, their shoulders slumped in the posture of the defeated. They stood in the oppressive heat, a silent congregation waiting for the final rites to be read over their future. Judge Groves, looking self-important and flushed in a black wool coat, ascended the steps. He held a gavel in one hand and a sheaf of papers in the other. Luke Madigan stood beside him, the picture of triumph. He scanned the crowd with the proprietary air of a man surveying a herd he was about to purchase. Deputy Hale and 3 hard-faced men Jonah had never seen before were positioned at the edges of the crowd, their hands resting casually on their holstered pistols. They were not there for security. They were there for intimidation. Jonah stood near the back, his own men, the blacksmith and Henry Cole among them, dispersed and watching. He had done what he could, deputizing a few good men in the pre-dawn hours. It was not strictly legal, but as Lila had shown him, sometimes the law was not enough. His eyes found her standing near the front with Tommy. The boy held her good hand tightly. She looked pale, the strain of the past weeks visible in the shadows beneath her eyes. But her back was straight. Her chin was up. She met Jonah's gaze across the crowd, and for a moment, a silent message of solidarity passed between them. He would hold the line. She would fight the war. "The proceedings are now open," Judge Groves announced, his voice oily with false solemnity. "By the authority vested in me by the Territorial Court, we will now auction the exclusive lease to all water rights currently held in receivership under the Hart Trust." He held up a document, a 99-year lease. Bidding will start at $5,000. The amount was staggering, an impossible sum for anyone in the territory except the man standing beside him. A heavy, hopeless silence fell over the crowd. "I will open the bidding at $5,000, Madigan said loudly, a grin spreading across his face. "Do I hear 6? Groves asked. A perfunctory, theatrical question, going once. "This auction is a fraud." Lila's voice, though not loud, cut through the silence with the sharp clarity of breaking glass. She stepped forward, releasing Tommy's hand and letting him stand with the blacksmith's wife. All eyes turned to her. "Miss Hart," Groves said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you are out of order. This is a legal proceeding." "It is a legal proceeding based on a series of crimes," she retorted. She held up 2 documents for all to see. In her left hand was an official court filing from a year ago. In her right was the deed transfer for the spring near the Miller place. "The official seal on this document," she said, pointing to the older one, "is the seal of this court. The seal on this one, the one that gives Mr. Madigan his claim, is a forgery." "It is no such thing," Groves blustered, his face turning a shade redder. "Is it not? Then perhaps you can explain this." She pointed to the small, embossed mark on the wax, the elegant looping monogram, the letters A.G. for Alistair Groves. Your personal monogram. Judge. Pressed into the wax of a public document, a little flourish to mark your work. Perhaps. A wave of murmurs and whispers swept through the crowd. They could see the mark from where they stood. An arrogant, damning piece of evidence. She was not finished, and the entire premise of this crisis, the fear you have used to manipulate this town, is also a lie. She pulled a folded yellow paper from her pocket. The rumor that the Heartlands were being sold to the railroad. A lie you started, Mr. Madigan. To panic my tenants into selling cheap. This is a telegram from the Union Pacific corporate office in Omaha. I received it this morning. She read aloud. To Miss Eliza Hart. In response to your query, the Union Pacific Railroad has no current or future plans for land acquisition in your county. We have no record of any memorandum of understanding, and we have certainly never had any dealings with a Mr. Luke Madigan. Your entire scheme is built on a foundation of lies and forged papers. Madigan's face was a mask of pure fury. She is twisting words, a rich Eastern heiress, playing games with all of you. Do not listen to her. The crowd was wavering, caught between the evidence of their own eyes and the deep-seated fear of the powerful. They wanted to believe her, but they had been kicked too many times to trust so easily. It was then that Samuel Miller, the rancher whose mortgage Lila had saved, pushed his way to the front. He was a small, weather-beaten man, not given to public speaking, but his voice was firm. I will listen to her, he said, his voice ringing with conviction. I do not know about telegrams or seals, but I know this. 2 weeks ago, on the day that man, he pointed at Madigan, chained our well, the bank was set to take my land. My family was going to be turned out with nothing. The next day, I went to the bank to beg for more time, and they told me my debt had been paid. In full. The agent said a quiet benefactor had settled it. He would not tell me who. He looked directly at Lila, his eyes shining with gratitude. I know who it was now. She did not do it for thanks. She did not even want me to know. She did it because it was the right thing to do. That is not the act of someone who wants to own us. That is the act of a neighbor. The social dam broke. Miller's simple, honest testimony was more powerful than any legal document. The people in the crowd looked at each other, a slow, dawning realization on their faces. They had been shown the truth. Madigan saw he was losing. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Deputy Hale. It was all the signal that was needed. Hale and the 3 hired guns drew their pistols. The first shot was not aimed at anyone. It was fired into the wooden sign of the courthouse, a deafening crack that sent splinters flying and the crowd into a screaming panic. Get down, Jonah roared, drawing his own weapon. He and his deputized men moved instantly, creating a line between the gunmen and the fleeing townspeople. The air exploded with the sound of gunfire, a chaotic, terrifying symphony of bangs and ricochets. People scrambled for cover behind wagons and water troughs. Jonah saw one of the gunmen aiming toward Lila. He fired, his shot going wide as a searing pain tore through his left shoulder. A bullet had grazed him. A hot, vicious line of fire. He stumbled but kept his feet, firing again, forcing the man back. Amid the chaos, Lila did not run for cover. She ran towards the newly installed pump near the courthouse, the one they had been using since the fire. She grabbed the long chain for the steam whistle and pulled with all her might. A piercing, continuous shriek ripped through the air, a sound so loud it was physically painful, drowning out the gunshots and the screams. It was a disorienting, overwhelming blast of sound. Under the cover of the noise, she began directing the terrified women and children, using hand signals to guide them to the safety of the thick-walled church. The whistle and the determined resistance of Jonah's small posse broke the hired gun's nerve. They were thugs, not soldiers. The blacksmith swung a heavy wrench that caught one man in the arm, sending his pistol flying. Henry Cole tackled another, Jonah, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, cornered Hale behind a wagon as the deputy fumbled to reload. Hale looked into the cold fury in Jonah's eyes, dropped his gun, and raised his hands. The last gunman, seeing it was over, took off running. disappearing between the buildings. The shooting stopped. Lila let go of the chain, and the shriek of the whistle died with a final, wheezing sigh into the ringing silence. Only the sound of a few crying children could be heard. Lila walked back to the courthouse steps, her face smudged with soot, her expression one of grim resolve. She picked up the 99-year lease document that Groves had dropped. She held it up for the silent, watching townspeople. Then, with a deliberate, powerful motion, she tore it in half. She tore the halves into quarters and let the pieces flutter to the dusty ground like dead leaves. "There will be no auction," she said, her voice clear and strong. "There will be no lease. The water belongs to this land, and to the people who live on it. From this day forward, every family in Mesquite Crossing will have a right to a basic share of water, free of charge. In times of drought, we will ration it fairly. We will form a Mesquite Water Council, elected by you to manage it. I will take a seat on that council, but only as one of you. The power is yours now." A stunned silence greeted her words. It was a concept so foreign, so radical, that they could not immediately grasp it. Power was not something that was given away. Jonah, clutching his bleeding shoulder, strode forward, dragging the captured gunman with him. The blacksmith followed with Hale in tow. Jonah shoved the gunman to his knees. He also held up the crumpled lamp oil receipt from the general store. "This man has a story to tell," Jonah said, his voice hard as iron, "about who paid him and his friends to start a fire, about who paid them to start shooting at women and children today." The captured gunman, seeing the hangman's noose in his future, began to talk, the words spilling out in a desperate, cowardly torrent. He confessed everything, implicating Madigan in the arson and the attack. It was over. The legal case was sealed. The social contract was rewritten. The violence had failed. Judge Groves stood frozen, his face a mask of utter ruin. Madigan looked like a man who had been struck by lightning. Jonah watched as his men took the prisoners away. The crowd, finally understanding what Lila had done, began to surge around her, their voices rising not in fear, but in a chorus of thanks and relief. Jonah stayed back, watching her. He saw the concern in her face as her eyes found him, as she saw the blood soaking through his shirt. She pushed through the crowd and came to him. He looked at her, and all the hurt, all the pride, all the foolish blindness he had felt was gone. He saw her not as the woman who had kept a secret, but as the leader who had given away a kingdom to save its people. He managed a small, tired smile. "If anyone ever asks why I live in this God-forsaken dust bowl," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "you tell them it is because there is someone here who makes this land breathe." In the aftermath, a new sound settled over Mesquite Crossing. It was the sound of work, but a different kind of work from the desperate, sun-beaten labor that had defined their lives for so long. It was the rhythmic rasp of a saw cutting through fresh pine and the cheerful clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Not on horseshoes, but on iron brackets for a new well shelter. The town was healing itself, nail by nail, board by board. Under the direction of a retired Army engineer and Henry Cole, the men cleared the old irrigation ditches, their shovels biting into earth that had been parched and useless for months. A system of shifts was organized for the hand pump at the courthouse, ensuring everyone got their fair share without exhausting the supply. The fear of thirst had been replaced by the quiet satisfaction of communal effort. Jonah Pike, his arm in a sling and his shoulder a constant, dull ache, found his duties had changed as well. He was still the sheriff, but now he spent less time breaking up saloon scuffles and more time mediating disputes over ditch-clearing boundaries. He found he did not mind. For the first time, he felt like a part of the town's foundation, not just its fence. One afternoon, he saw Tommy sitting on the steps of the general store, not with a slingshot, but with one of Lila's large survey maps spread across his knees. Lila sat beside him, her own bandaged arm resting on her lap, her good hand tracing the faint blue lines that snaked across the paper. "This line is an aquifer," she was explaining, her voice soft. "Think of it like a river. but deep underground, all these smaller lines are the little streams that feed it. Our wells are like straws, dipping down to take a drink from that river." Tommy was enthralled, his brow furrowed in concentration. "So the whole town is drinking from the same river?" he asked. "Exactly," Lila said with a smile. "That is why we have to share the straws." Jonah watched them from a distance, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. He saw the easy way Lila had assumed the role of teacher, the natural way Tommy sought her out. A few days earlier, in an attempt to lighten the mood and prove he was not completely useless with his left hand, Jonah had found some long reeds by the creek and had tried to weave a basket. The result was a lopsided, pathetic-looking thing that Tommy had immediately declared was a sick bird's nest. Jonah, instead of being offended, had laughed, a real deep laugh that made his shoulder ache. He kept the sick bird's nest on his desk. He found himself wanting to do things like that, foolish, clumsy things, just to hear the sound of laughter in his small house again. He was weaving poorly. He knew, but he was willing to learn. Later that week, as the day cooled and the sky began to bleed into shades of orange and violet, Jonah saw Lila packing up her sewing for the day. He walked across the street, the dust muffling his footsteps. He felt a familiar knot of awkwardness in his stomach, the same feeling he had had at the market fair what felt like a lifetime ago. He stopped before her. "Miss Hart," he began, his voice a little rough. She looked up, and the weariness in her eyes was replaced by a soft watchfulness. "Sheriff, I was wondering," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I was wondering if I could walk you home." A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. She did not say that they were already standing in front of her home. She simply nodded. "I would like that very much, Jonah." They did not go inside. Instead, they walked, with no destination in mind, heading out toward the edge of town where the desert began. They moved slowly, their pace unhurried, falling into a comfortable silence. The setting sun cast their shadows long and thin upon the red dust, making them look like giants striding across the wounded land. They passed the old mesquite tree, its sparse leaves catching the last of the light, shimmering like a shower of golden needles. Jonah was the first to speak, his voice low. "I need to apologize, Lila." "For what? For getting shot?" He shook his head. "For being a fool. When you told everyone who you were, I was angry. I felt like you had deceived me. My pride was hurt." He gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. "The sheriff was the last to know. It was a selfish way to think. I could not see past my own wounded feelings to see what you were actually doing. You were saving us, and I just stood there in the shadows, feeling sorry for myself." "I am sorry." Lila was silent for a long moment, watching the horizon. Then she stopped and turned to face him. "I am the one who should be sorry," she said, her voice laced with a deep sincerity. "I lived a lie. Jonah, I had my reasons, and I believed they were good ones. I did not think I could trust anyone with the truth. I see now that was a mistake. I should have trusted you. I was just so focused on my father's legacy, on the maps and the deeds. I forgot that the most important part of any home is the people you share it with. Hiding my name was one thing, but hiding my heart from you, that was the real lie. And I am sorry for it." He reached out with his good hand and, with a gentleness that surprised even himself, he touched her face, his thumb brushing away a speck of dust from her cheek. The apology hung in the air between them, a bridge built across the chasm of misunderstanding. They continued their walk, and as they passed the newly repaired town well, Jonah unhooked the tin dipper. He pumped the handle, the squeak of the iron no longer a sound of desperation but of steady promise. He filled the dipper and offered it to her. She drank, then filled it again and passed it back to him. The simple act of sharing water, of the cool metal passing from her hand to his, felt more intimate than a kiss. It was a a renewal of a fundamental trust. The first meeting of the Mesquite Water Council was held 2 days later in the church. It was a clumsy, earnest affair. Henry Cole was elected chairman, and a young engineer who had been working on the railroad survey was appointed to oversee the mechanics of the pump systems. Lila sat with them, offering advice when asked, clarifying points from her father's old notes. But she refused to cast a deciding vote. She listened, she guided, but she did not rule. When the meeting was over, she handed the engineer a large ring of old iron keys. "These are for the warehouse and the pumping stations," she said. "The daily operations are in your hands now. I trust you all to be good stewards." The next morning, the town was surprised to see a newly painted sign hanging above the entrance to the small space next to the general store. It read, simply, E. Hart, Seamstress. Jonah found her inside, sweeping the floor, the space filled with bolts of cloth and patterns pinned to the walls. It looked as if she had never left. "I thought you would be in an office somewhere, counting your money," he said, leaning against the doorframe, a teasing smile on his face. She looked up at him, a smudge of dust on her nose, and miss all this, she said, her eyes twinkling. "Besides, someone has to mend the sheriff's shirts. I hear he is terribly hard on them." She had built a new world for Mesquite Crossing, and then she had chosen her own small place in it. She was not a distant landlord or a powerful heiress anymore. She was Lila, the seamstress, the small shop of a great woman, and for the first time in a very long time, Jonah Pike felt like he was truly home. The night of the Lantern Festival was a night Mesquite Crossing had not known in a generation. It was a night born not of calendar tradition, but of shared triumph. Lanterns, crafted from pierced tin cans and scavenged glass jars, hung from every awning and porch post, their small, flickering flames casting a warm, golden glow that pushed back the vast, indifferent darkness of the desert. The oppressive dust of summer had been settled by a brief, miraculous shower 2 days prior, and the air was clean and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant aroma of baking bread. Instead of the anxious murmur of a town on the brink, there was music. A fiddle and a guitar played a lively tune near the new, covered well, and the sound of laughter, real and unburdened, wove through the gentle evening breeze. The people were not just celebrating the return of water, they were celebrating the return of themselves. They had ceased to be a collection of desperate individuals and had become a community again, bound by the shared memory of hardship and the shared work of rebuilding. Jonah Pike stood with Lila and Tommy near the edge of the festivities, watching the dancers. The sling was gone from his arm, though a deep, puckered scar on his shoulder served as a permanent reminder of the town's rebirth. He felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost unnerving. For years, his life had been a series of duties, a relentless patrol against the encroaching chaos. Now, for the first time, he felt he was not just guarding the town, but truly living in it. Lila was wearing a simple blue dress, one she had likely made herself. The soft lantern light caught the warm tones in her dark hair and softened the resolute line of her jaw. She was no longer the watchful, guarded seamstress, nor the formidable landowner who had faced down thieves and liars. Tonight, she was simply Lila, her eyes reflecting the small, dancing flames, a quiet contentment resting on her like a shawl. Tommy, his face scrubbed clean and his hair neatly combed for the occasion, was a whirlwind of pure joy. He darted between them, his small hand occasionally reaching up to find one of theirs, a grounding touch before he ran off again to chase a moth fluttering near a lantern. He was a child again, his world no longer defined by the fear of fire or thirst, but by the simple, glorious freedom of a summer night. He came running back to them, his face serious with the sudden, solemn importance of an 8-year-old with a question. He stopped in front of Lila, looking up at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "Ma'am," he began, then hesitated, his mouth working as if trying to find the right shape for a new and unfamiliar word. He glanced at Jonah, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before looking back at Lila, or maybe Mama. The question was a whisper, so quiet it was nearly lost beneath the fiddle music, but in the small space between the three of them, it landed with the weight of a prayer. The world seemed to stop. The music, the laughter, the dancing flames, all of it faded into a distant hum. Lila's breath caught in her throat. 1,000 emotions washed over her face in the lantern light. Surprise, awe, a deep and breathtaking tenderness. She looked at Jonah, her dark eyes shining, her lips slightly parted. She did not know how to answer. Jonah looked down at the boy, his heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. He saw his sister's eyes in Tommy's face, and he saw the boy's own brave, searching spirit. He rested a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. He smiled, a slow, kind smile that smoothed the weary lines around his own eyes. You choose the name that feels warm to you, son. Tommy considered this with great seriousness for a moment. Then a slow, radiant smile spread across his face. He reached out and took Lila's hand, a silent answer that was more powerful than any word. Lila's fingers closed around his, her touch a promise. They stayed like that for a long time, a silent, unmoving trinity in the heart of the celebration, a family forged not of law or lineage, but of choice. The justice they had fought for was not found in a courtroom verdict. It was here, in the simple, profound right of a child to feel safe and loved. The land and the water were the inheritance of the town, but this small, perfect moment of belonging was theirs. As the music softened and the crowd began to thin, the three of them started to walk away from the well, their path lit by the dwindling lanterns. They moved together, a comfortable, unspoken rhythm to their steps. The night was growing quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the soft crunch of their boots on the sandy street. When they reached the old mesquite tree, its branches stark against the star-dusted sky, Jonah stopped. He turned to Lila, the faint light from her shop window illuminating one side of her face. He saw in her eyes the memory of everything they had been through, the suspicion, the fear, the fire, the trust. He saw the woman who had faced down his own foolish pride, and the woman who had charged into a burning building to save his son. He saw the leader who had given away an empire, and the seamstress who had mended the fabric of their town. He held out his good hand, his palm open, just as he had on that dusty evening at the market fair. A small smile played on his lips, a smile full of memory and meaning, and a deep, unwavering certainty. "Can I walk you home, miss?" He knew who she was now. He knew that home was not a room above a general store or a house behind a jail. Home was the quiet, steadfast space between them. It was the choice to walk beside her, not just for a night, but for all the nights to come. In this harsh and unforgiving land, they had found the one thing that could not be burned or stolen or chained. They had found the softest and most durable thing of all. They had found faith in each other. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to Wild West Night. Like the video, and press the hype button to help more people hear this tale.